There is a place in the heart of North America where you can walk past a gate and suddenly you belong to no one. You aren't in the United States and you aren't in Canada. You are in a 2,000-acre legal black hole where a single wrong turn can leave you stateless for days. No signs warn you. No officer stops you. No alarm sounds. One moment, a visitor is standing on American soil. The next, after crossing an invisible threshold that no map marks clearly, they are standing in jurisdictional purgatory, a strip of land governed by a handshake agreement between two nations that, when tested, falls apart almost completely. This is the International Peace Garden, straddling the border of North Dakota and Manitoba, Canada, established in 1932 as a symbol of friendship, of harmony, of two nations at peace. That's the brochure version. The reality is something colder, something stranger, a legal trap dressed up in flower beds and flagpoles, visited by hundreds of thousands of people who have absolutely no idea what they're walking into. This is the story of the void. Every summer, families pack into minivans, drive hours across flat prairie highways, and pull into the International Peace Garden expecting a park. And in fairness, it looks like one. There are manicured gardens, a floral clock made of living plants, a 9/11 memorial. There are picnic tables and a lodge. Children run through fountains. Grandparents take photographs. And then someone needs to leave. This is where the Peace Garden reveals its first quiet betrayal. The garden sits directly on the 49th parallel, the straight-line border that divides the United States from Canada across most of the continent. But the garden's entrance, its main gate, its parking lot, all of it sits on the American side, specifically in Rolette County, North Dakota. Visitors drive in from Highway 281, flash a smile at a small booth that for most of the garden's operating hours is barely staffed, and they walk freely into the grounds. Here is what most of them do not know. A portion of those grounds, the northern section, is Canadian territory. And once a visitor has wandered north of a certain point, they have entered Canada. Without a customs declaration, without a border crossing, without presenting any identification whatsoever. That alone is remarkable. But the trap doesn't spring until the return trip, because here is the rule that catches hundreds of visitors every single year to re-enter the United States after crossing into Canada, even accidentally, even by 40 feet, even for 90 seconds to look at a flower bed. A visitor is legally required to present a valid passport or a Nexus card at a staffed port of entry. The Peace Garden has one of those, a small official U.S. Customs and Border Protection booth, open during limited hours. And when that booth is open, and when a visitor approaches it without a passport, the officer looks at them. The officer asks where they've been, and the visitor says, "The Peace Garden," and the officer says, "Have you crossed north of the center line?" And the visitor, who has no idea what the center line is, says, "I don't know. Maybe. I walked around quite a bit." And just like that, the trap closes. Without valid travel documentation, that visitor cannot legally re-enter the United States. They are not in Canada. Canada has no record of them entering. They haven't passed through a Canadian port of entry either. They are standing in a parking lot on a strip of land governed by a bilateral agreement, and neither nation has a clean legal claim to process them in the normal way. They are, for all practical purposes, stateless. Temporarily, but genuinely. Stuck in limbo in a place that markets itself as a celebration of peace. Border Patrol agents have discretion in these cases, and most are resolved slowly with phone calls with supervisors, with identity verification that can take hours. But the resolution is not guaranteed. It is not automatic, and the legal position of the stranded visitor while they wait is genuinely ambiguous in ways that should unsettle anyone who values the clarity of citizenship. This happens every summer, multiple times. The garden's own visitor literature gently mentions that travel documents may be required. Maybe. As if this were a suggestion. As if the United States Customs and Border Protection were running a suggestions box. The Peace Garden's administrators know about this problem. American border officials know about it. Canadian border officials know about it. It has been known for decades. And still, every year, families arrive without passports because why would they bring a passport? They're going to a park in North Dakota. Now consider something darker. Consider what happens when the problem isn't a missing passport. Consider what happens when something goes wrong inside the garden. A fight, a theft, a medical emergency that becomes a criminal matter, an assault, something that requires not just a phone call to a supervisor, but a badge, a crime scene, a jurisdiction. Who comes? The answer is, it depends. And in law enforcement, it depends is one of the most dangerous phrases in existence. The International Peace Garden is not a sovereign territory. It is not a federal reservation. It is not an embassy. It exists under a unique legal framework established through a combination of North Dakota state law, Canadian provincial agreement, and a federal memorandum of understanding that creates a shared administrative zone. What it does not create with any clarity is a unified law enforcement jurisdiction. If a crime occurs on the American side of the garden's interior, south of the 49th parallel, it falls theoretically under North Dakota state law, with possible federal involvement if the crime involves border violations. The nearest sheriff is in Rolette County. The nearest U.S. Border Patrol station covers an enormous stretch of prairie. Response time is not fast. If a crime occurs on the Canadian side, north of the line, it falls under the jurisdiction of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, operating out of Manitoba. Again, coverage is vast. Response is not immediate, but here is where the legal void truly opens. What if the crime occurs in a location where the exact position of the 49th parallel is unclear on the ground? What if it occurs in the shared facilities, the lodge, the amphitheater, spaces that straddle the line architecturally and administratively? What if the perpetrator moves across the line between the act and the arrival of officers? There is no joint law enforcement command. There is no standing bilateral protocol that automatically triggers a combined response. Each incident is handled on a case-by-case basis through communication between agencies that speak different legal languages, one operating under American federal and state law, the other under Canadian federal and provincial law. The legal processes for evidence collection, witness testimony, arrest procedures, and prosecution are not the same. They are not designed to interlock seamlessly in a 2,000-acre park in the middle of the continent. This is not theoretical paranoia. Legal scholars who study transboundary governance have identified the Peace Garden as one of the most unusual jurisdictional spaces on the continent, a place where the ordinary assumptions of law enforcement simply do not apply in the ordinary way. The Peace Garden's administration handles most issues internally. Security staff patrol the grounds. Incidents are rare and usually minor, but the framework, the legal architecture underneath the flower beds, has gaps in it that no amount of goodwill has ever fully closed. In the wrong circumstances, those gaps become a void, and a void by definition is a place where the normal rules do not reach. To understand why this legal complexity exists, it's necessary to go back to 1929. A group of civic organizations, one American, one Canadian, proposed building a living monument to the peaceful relationship between the two nations. A garden right on the border, a place where the line between countries would become symbolically invisible. The idea was beautiful. It was also, from a governance standpoint, almost entirely unplanned. The garden was incorporated under North Dakota state law in 1931. Canada recognized it through its own legislative channels. The shared administration was formalized, but the deeper legal questions, jurisdiction, law enforcement, customs, immigration, were handled through the lightest possible touch. A gentleman's agreement between two friendly nations who assumed the friendliness would handle most problems. For decades, it worked. The border between the United States and Canada was famously undefended, celebrated as the longest peaceful international boundary in the world. Traffic through the Peace Garden required minimal documentation. The 49th parallel at this quiet stretch of prairie felt more like a suggestion than a legal threshold. Then came September 11th, 2001, the post-9/11 security architecture that reshaped American border policy hit the Peace Garden in ways its founders could never have imagined. Passport requirements, previously waived for Americans and Canadians crossing at informal or low traffic points, were tightened, then tightened again. The Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, implemented between 2007 and 2009, formalized the passport requirement for land border crossings. Suddenly, the Peace Garden's casual, document-optional entry culture was in direct conflict with federal law. The garden did not change. The law did. And the gap between the garden's identity, an open, symbolic space of friendship, and its legal reality, an international border crossing subject to all federal customs and immigration requirements, became a yawning trap. Border Patrol resources in the region were always stretched thin. The 49th parallel across the northern plains is not a wall. It is not a fence. In many places, it is nothing more than a series of survey markers set into the ground at intervals, barely visible, entirely crossable. The Peace Garden sits inside a region where that permeability is the historical norm, and where modern security mandates have created new obligations that the physical landscape and the administrative framework were never built to support. The result? A monument to peace that now requires law enforcement management, a symbol of open friendship that now generates every single summer a stream of confused, documentless civilians who walked past a flower bed and accidentally committed a federal border violation, and a jurisdictional structure frozen in 1932 that has never been adequately updated to reflect the legal world of the 21st century. Two governments created this buffer zone because they trusted each other, because they believed trust was enough. What they built, over 90 years of accumulated complexity, is a legal nightmare dressed in petunias. The Peace Garden is a trap of convenience. It was not designed to ensnare anyone. It simply wasn't designed at all, not for the world it now exists in. The void at its center is an accident of friendship, a gap where law forgot to look because everyone assumed goodwill would cover the distance. But not every gap on the American border is accidental. 500 miles to the west, there is a mountain pass, a high, remote crossing in the Rocky Mountain wilderness where the border was moved, quietly, without public announcement, without a press release, where the official surveyors adjusted the line in the 1990s, and where records that should be public are, to this day, not easy to find. The question of why the border was moved has a documented answer. The question of what that movement concealed, what sat on the wrong side of the original line, and why it mattered enough to redraw, is something that took years of records requests to begin to understand. That's where this investigation goes next. The Peace Garden gave us the accident. The mountain pass shows us the intention, and intention in jurisdictional law is everything.